Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to another webinar from the TUC. I'm Anna, and I'm joined today by Dan Shears from the GMB. I'll be going to him in a little bit, just a little bit of housekeeping before we get going. Great to see so many of you already introducing yourselves in the chat panel on the right-hand side. It's great to see. You can post the questions for Dan that we'll get to after I've asked him some questions about our subject today. So please post them in the question panel, which is the speech bubble with a question mark in it on the right-hand side of the screen. You can watch with captions. If you click the green button at the bottom of the screen, you'll be able to follow along with live captions. And as ever, we are recording today. And if you miss anything or you need to drop off, we'll make sure you get sent a recording of the webinar. So you've probably noticed that I'm wearing this quite cool hat today from megaphones.org.uk, which is a TUC campaign website. And this is in honour of today's subject, which is about cold temperatures at work. So I don't really need the hat today, but just to kind of remind us what we're talking about. So, as I said, Dan joins us from the GMB, and he is the Health, Safety and Welfare Officer there. So the first question I'm going to put to him about our subject is, what do we mean by cold weather working, Dan?
Well, hi, Anna, and hi, everyone. Good afternoon. Before I answer that, a couple of very quick apologies, really. One is that I'm in an open plan office here, so you may see some background activity or noise. Apologies for that. And the second is, although we've not had a spell of cold weather, I've just come back to work with the flu. So if I'm a bit croakier than usual, apologies for that as well. But no, this is a well-timed seminar and quite a good question to start with. Because people often think, Anna, that when we talk about cold weather working, we talk about snow. And actually, it's much broader than that. Obviously, any time we might have a cold snap, that's going to have impacts on work. It's going to have impacts on people doing work. But really, we're not just talking about snow. We're talking about heavy rain. We're talking about fog. Increasingly, we're talking about flooding. You know, the number of very high-profile floods in the last 5 years, to my mind, very clearly linked to climate change and the way that the UK climate, the seasons are changing. We might be talking about misty conditions as well. So it isn't just a classic, you know, the temperature drops below freezing and suddenly there's a need to change approach. These are things that happen quite regularly, the things that need to be planned for. But really, when we're talking about cold weather working, any sort of cold weather, any severe drop in temperature, wet weather, fog, mist, heavy rain, and obviously snow and ice, which are the ones that people often think of the most.
That's really interesting, Dan, especially your clarification around just generally untypical weather, really, yeah. Weather that might be uncomfortable or difficult in some way, but we're specifically talking about the cold today. So how does working in the cold impact on people's health?
Well, I mean, this is the standard thing. People often think of it as being twofold. One is a temperature issue, in terms of obviously people get colder, that affects concentration. But obviously there are also safety implications. If you're working in the wet or in the ice in particular, the risk of falling over is obviously hugely increased. The risk of having an accident if you're driving is increased as well. In health terms, what we're really looking is the extremities. It's feet, it's hands in the first instance. So if you're working out in the cold, in the wet, even indoors in cold and wet temperatures, GMB has a lot of members that work in retail, that work in chill and frozen areas. Obviously, that's very cold working. And yeah, you can be affected quite badly. Skin can get affected, muscles get affected by that. It's often more obvious with the hands and the feet. People tend to notice the hands discolouring quickly, a lack of sensation more easily in the hands. And often, again, if you're working outside, you'll have the protective equipment that means it's less of an issue for you. But yeah, it's that lack of circulation. It's the muscular damage that might be done as a result. We know that if you're repetitively working cold temperatures, your chances of getting muscle injuries, your chances of getting effectively cold temperature issues and cold stress are hugely increased. So it really is anything that might affect circulation, anything that might affect muscles, and ultimately actually anything that might affect concentration as well, in particularly cold temperatures. When your body's core temperature starts to reduce, then you see quite profound impacts quite quickly on people's productivity, people's concentration. So it is definitely a health issue, but it's also a safety issue to a degree, because if your decision making, if your critical functions are impacted, then you start behaving more erratically, potentially more unsafely. So both of these things need to be looked at.
Thanks, Dan. Just before we go on to the next question, I think your microphone is rubbing a little bit on your lanyard.
Okay.
Can you just maybe
I'll try and pop this off.
yeah, if you could,
Sorry.
maybe hit it so much. That's good.
Okay.
Thank you. Right. So, what kind of temperatures are we talking about that might start to cause some of the issues you just mentioned? What should people be looking out for in terms of how cold it is?
Yeah, so two ways of looking at this. There are very clear laws, and we'll come on to those probably more later, in terms of indoor temperature. And the standards there are generally 13 degrees for general everyday working, what you might consider office working, shop working. 16 degrees if people are doing, the other way around, 16 degrees for general working, 13 degrees if you're doing heavy work, so very hard physical manual labour. Those are well-established legal standards. But obviously outside, there are no sort of protections as such. The law is not applicable in the same way outside. So you don't have these hard and fast rules. But there you're looking at anything that may reduce core body temperature. And generally that would be considered sort of 0 and below. But having said that, obviously you can be working temperatures that are above 0, where because of wind chill, it feels much colder. It's quite easy and quite straightforward, especially if you're working in an area that's quite rural. You might be at 4 or 5 degrees in terms of the thermometer, but actually if it's a particularly windy day, a particularly chill day, it will feel much cooler, much colder. And if you haven't got the right equipment, then your body temperature will drop quite quickly. So it is in both circumstances a question of looking at what, not the kind of just the ambient temperature is, but the conditions around the ambient temperature. And then really what protections are already in place and what more needs to be done. But the key sort of concept here is things that will reduce that core temperature. Because as I said earlier on, once you hit a sort of low body temperature, your body will start to react to that, and that will have implications. Things will start, effectively stopping working properly. Brain functions start to slow down, heart rate can start to slow, pace of work will often drop, and that can have implications, especially doing some sort of manual work outside. For people that are often using work with chainsaws or other equipment that's got quite high safety considerations, if you start getting very cold, that's when you can easily make a mistake and start really causing yourself some harm. So yeah, the legal standards, as I say, for indoor work, to be absolutely clear on this, are 16 degrees and 13 degrees. But outside, there's no minimum temperature as such, but there's still a need for employers to take all due necessary measures to ensure that people are not affected by that cold weather.
That's really interesting, Dan. And obviously, all the things you said so far, reps, unions, unfortunately, we can't control the weather. That is absolutely something that just comes. But what are the sorts of issues that reps can be aware of when it's cold that they might then want to raise with the employer? Because there are some things that can be controlled. So what should they be looking out for?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. There are obvious things to be taken into consideration. The first for most workplaces is going to be standards of ventilation and air conditioning. So most modern buildings these days will have air conditioning of some sort. Often employers will ensure they're set at a certain level, so they're not producing excessive heat. They're not costing them sort of more money than they need to in terms of running those systems. But obviously you want those systems to be set at a point that's comfortable for everybody. Now, not everyone has that opportunity. We know from our own experience in GMB. Members that work in schools, some members that work in hospitals, members that work in older warehousing in particular, some factories. There isn't the sophisticated system there, but there is still a need to ensure that temperature is regulated and managed. So in the first instance, actually, it's having a measurement in place. It's being able to say for definite, right, well, it feels colder today. What does the ambient temperature look like? Then it's about understanding who controls that measurement of temperature. I mean, here in my office in GMB, we've got some quite good air conditioning systems introduced post-COVID. Everything's remotely controlled. We've got sensors in place that tell us different parts of the buildings what the temperature is. But if I didn't have that, what I'd be looking for is a thermometer where I can effectively go and take readings at different times of the day in different areas of the workplace. Because what classically will happen is the management will say, well, actually, we've done the checks, we've got the thermometer out. In the kitchen, it's 17 degrees, 19 degrees, because that's where you've got the things that are heated. That's where you've got potentially the toaster, the kettle, the microwave, whatever it may be, perhaps a cooker. So you might have much more residual heat there. In areas of, say, office work, you might have people clustered together that are much warmer than you've got in the most remote parts of the factory. So if you're relying on managers to take readings, you may be given a very false impression of actually how cold the workplace is and therefore what the health issues are. So the first thing is really getting accurate readings that reflect where things are at different parts of the day, the different parts of the workplace. Because obviously, again, during the coldest day, there'll be times when it's lighter and other times there'll be times when it's warmer naturally than other times. You know, if you look at the BBC website at a given time, it's rare that the temperature is absolutely constant the whole day. It tends to rise and drop. So that should be reflected in the management approach. But then if you are starting to see people that are shivering, if you're starting to see people with skin discoloration, and again, that's often an outside phenomenon, but it can be indoors as well. If you've got situations where, for say, COVID control reasons, you've got open windows, there'll need to be effectively extra temperature controls in place. That will normally be provision of local heating. The regulations are quite clear around this. They don't specify how you do it, but they do say it must be a reasonable temperature, and that temperature has been defined as 16 and 13. So if you can't hit those temperatures, you're looking to supplement in terms of bringing additional heating in, or alternatively, taking people away from that cold area. Now, obviously, outdoors, it's very different because you can't generally sort of blast hot air at people while they're working. So then we're looking at protective clothing, and again, rotating people in and out of work. But in the first instance, you know, you want confidence that you've got accurate temperature readings, that genuinely things are as cold as they feel, or for the management team they're warmer, they can substantiate that. But also, it's the subtle symptoms that you see from people. You know, not just the obvious shivering. People may be putting their coats on, scarves on during work time. They may have a lovely megaphone hat on during the working day. If that's the case, there's an obvious signifier here that things are wrong. One of the things that we often see during people's workplace inspections is a sense that because they look at the area that they work in and things are okay there, which is often the office, that things must be okay everywhere. And obviously, if you work in a school, a university, a hospital, you've got quite a large estate. You might have people that spend most of their time working outside. Their experience is going to be very different from the people that are potentially managing this circumstance, that are in the warm all day, that can make a hot drink whenever they want, that don't have any kind of restriction. So it's very much a case of looking at things in the round. But again, it is very much that sense of the cold temperature, the visual signifiers, and the actual physical experience.
So you mentioned there, Dan, about inspections of the workplace, which we know is a kind of core activity of safety reps. We can point you towards other resources about conducting effective safety inspections, and we will make sure they're included for our audience in the email we send round. But yeah, I think really key point there is if you do see people in the indoors putting their coats on, putting their hats on, they're trying to keep themselves warm, and actually the ambient temperature should be kept at a reasonable level. So I'm actually going to take this off because I'm also hot. So yeah, it's people are wearing their hats, not necessarily a good sign if you're inside. Okay, so we've talked a lot there about what you can do inside, and you briefly touched on the outside, which we obviously can't control, and it's much more difficult. But you suggested that people could be rotated in and out of that environment if it was very cold. What would be a reasonable time to be rotating if it was cold, so you weren't exposed to that temperature for too long?
Yeah, I mean, that will ultimately be a question for risk assessment more than anything. So the first real kind of action is to find out what the existing risk assessment says, if there is one. Will depend very much on whether it's pre-planned everyday work. We have members that work in parks, that work for local authorities outside most of the time. Their work will be very structured, the same sort of work every day. People that, for instance, work on waste and recycling. That work won't really change very much. It's often quite physical work. It may be done in the wet. There may be times when the temperature actually will change quite dramatically over the course of a shift. And therefore, what you're trying to balance is two different elements. One is the nature of the work, the heaviness, the sweating that may be caused, but then also the fact that it might be very cold, it might be raining. So you'd be looking to say, right, you want people ideally maybe cover one street, depending on the length of the street, then back in the vehicle, perhaps rotating between driving the wagon and being outside, actually moving the bins. If you're looking at a situation where you work in, say, a park, it might be half an hour to 40 minutes of work, then back inside, hot drink, rest break, back outside, rotating that way. If it's much more kind of one-off work, we've got members that work in utilities that might have to dig roads up, do pipe replacement, do emergency repair works. That's much more conditioned by the safety element of what they're doing, but it's also then a question of how many people do you need to do this? How long do you need to do it for? You know, if it's skilled work, if it's safety critical work, you may not be able to leave it until the job's been completed. If you're patching a pipe, for instance, or replacing cabling, It may be you need to be at that work regardless of the weather circumstances until it's completed. So in that case, you're looking at, right, have we got the right facilities in place? If you do need to take a step away, if you do get genuinely so wet that you can't work safely, can someone take that work over? It's a question really of what the circumstances are, what the weather conditions are, the nature of the work. But that should be risk assessed. It's going to be very few and far between. There might be very extreme circumstances where someone is having to do work that's genuinely dynamic. But for the most part, a risk assessment should be in place. As a general rule of thumb, I think 30 to 45 minutes in very cold weather with the right PPE. But again, if it's going outside in very bad weather with no PPE, that's obviously going to be very, very short duration work. It depends on the level of PPE that's there, the nature of the work activity, and the overall expected duration of the work activity as to how long people should be going out. In kind of cold store working indoors, you're looking at kind of 45 to 50 minutes of work with a 10-minute break every hour because it is so cold there and the health effects are so well known. But again, it should be really clear what the expectation is. There should be instructions given on this. And ultimately, my advice actually to anybody out there would be if there's any uncertainty, there's any lack of clarity around it, to get a very clear instruction from the individual local manager around that, preferably in writing. So if there is a challenge down the line, there's an ability to say, look, we asked the question, we've been very clear on the expectation here, you directed this. If people do develop ill health, or even in the short term, there's an issue around getting wet, getting cold, you can challenge immediately and say, well, this was the directive. But yeah, it depends on a number of circumstances. It's quite a complex thing to look at. But again, these things, although they're unusual in some respects in terms of weather, they do happen every year. This idea that we have these one-off freak extreme weather events is becoming less and less rare, actually. They're happening more often. So these things are foreseeable, so they should be planned for. There should be policies around them, and ultimately the risk assessment should be there. Whether it's a good risk assessment, slightly different question, but there should be an expectation now that there is a risk assessment for this, because the chances are it may happen at some point during the working year.
Yeah, absolutely. One thing we can say is weather is cyclical, isn't it? We know that in the winter it's going to be colder, so it's really not a surprise that we're going to get some cold weather in the winter months. And let's face it, even beyond that, we don't live in the Mediterranean. So next question's a little bit different. What are the travel implications when it's cold? Because many of us have to leave our homes to work, either by public transport or by driving or cycling or another way. What are the implications there for when we have bad weather?
Yeah, so again, there are two different elements to this. One is the getting to work, getting from work element. So obviously, if there's particularly bad, particularly extreme weather in some respects, if you're looking at snow, ice, very heavy rain, flooding, it may not be reasonable for your employer to expect you to get to your place of work. Now, that obviously would depend on where your place of work is, as you said, how you get there. If you're reliant on public transport and there's no train running, there's no bus, there's no tube in London, then potentially you've got an immediate problem. If your workplace is half a mile down the road, it may be reasonable to expect you to walk as long as you've got sufficient footwear to do that. Obviously, if you work 50 miles away, that's not going to be easily done. So it does really depend on what's reasonable under the circumstances. Again, companies should have policies in place. Employers should have policies in place around this. It's not unusual for there to be snow. It tends to happen at least once every winter. Flooding is becoming more commonplace. So there should be an understanding of what needs to be done. The big challenge around this, frankly, is that employers tend to see the at-work bit being the important bit, whereas actually it may be the getting to and from work bit that's really significant. And again, it may be that at the start of the working day, actually the weather is not too bad. It is quite easy to get into work, or it's not a challenge to get into the workplace. Then if the weather deteriorates over the course of the day, then it might be much more difficult to get home. It's one thing to say, right, if you work in central London, as we both are, we've got hotel provision. You can potentially book yourself into a hotel. It's not ideal, but you don't want to be stuck in an office on your own all night with no way of getting home. Obviously, if you work more remotely, that's more of an issue. Again, we have members whose job it is to go out. We've got members that work in utilities and the emergency services, whose job is literally to go out when there is very bad weather because of the high importance of what they do. In those circumstances, they should have vehicles that are provided with potentially snow chains. There should be allowances made in terms of getting into work. The vehicles they're driving should generally be suitable for that kind of driving. There should be, again, allowances made for extra time to make hot drinks before you go. It's advisable actually for anybody commuting, whether it's driving or on public transport during bad weather, to try and take a hot drink, to wear warm clothing, scarf, hat, gloves, and there should be time allowed actually to do that. And again, at the end of the day, if it looks like you're heading into bad weather, to make a hot drink, potentially take a flask and fill that before you go, because it may take much longer. The last time we had bad weather disruption in London, it took me nearly 4 hours to get home. I live 15 miles out from the centre. So yeah, there are real implications to that. But the other side of this is that many employers will have a policy in place that says, we expect you to make all reasonable effort. They may say, we expect you to undertake a dynamic risk assessment around this, which is fine to a point. It's not a problem as long as the worker has been trained to understand what that dynamic risk assessment looks like. Because obviously, if your job is normally working in an office, suddenly trying to understand the risk of walking several miles in snow or in heavy rain or in fog to get to an office, you may not be competent to do that. It may seem like a silly thing to say, but actually, not everyone's got a good pair of boots, Wellington boots or stout walking boots to get to work. So if you're trying to do it in your normal working shoes, they may not be suitable at all. You may have a genuine risk of falling over and hurting yourself. Beyond that, if you're looking at driving, you might not have experience in driving in bad weather conditions. It may not be something you do very often. Most people these days that have the opportunity to work from home, employers will generally allow them to do so. But again, not everyone can do that. Some people's jobs are reliant on them getting to work. You can't generally work from home if you work in a supermarket. So there has to be an allowance made there. But if ultimately the company's policy is you undertake your own personal dynamic risk assessment, it has to be understood then, has to be accepted that the answer to that may be, I'm very sorry, it's not safe for me to travel into work, I can't do that. Now, there may be implications of that in terms of pay and in terms of conditions, but actually, that is the lesser of two evils in some respect. What we don't want is a situation where someone feels obligated to get into work, jumps into a car during what are very clearly unsafe driving conditions and has an accident. There is still a duty of care. There will be an argument as to whether people are at work when they jump in their car, or whether they get to the workplace. And our silver-tongued friends in the legal profession would generally say it's when they arrive at work. But if the employer knowingly compels them to get to work in unsafe conditions, there may be an issue. So it's certainly in everyone's interest to be very clear about that. And as I say, it's one thing to have this dynamic risk assessment approach. That's not a get-out-of-jail-free card for employers. They still have to understand and mitigate that risk. And it may be the safest option in all circumstances to say, no, stay at home today, and we'll find a workaround.
Thanks, Dan. That's really helpful about what people should be considering in a bad weather policy, or when an employer is doing these risk assessments for these situations. And as you say, they need to be dynamic, not static, and consider all the possible scenarios, or as many scenarios as they can sort of envisage, really, rather than just you're going to come in no matter how far you live.
I mean, just the other thing I would say very quickly on that, Anna, is employers should also be learning from experience.
Sure.
We do get bad weather conditions every year. If there is a particular experience where things don't go well, or policies aren't enacted, or people are unclear on what's happened, then that should be understood. It needs to be analysed and investigated to identify where failings have happened, and then really the policy needs to be reviewed, to be looked at, because it clearly hasn't worked. Again, one of the other issues we tend to see is a situation where there are managers who are able to work from home and therefore stay at home while the rest of the working population is at the workplace. And then you have secondary issues about a lack of oversight. So people have got to work, but there's no one directing what they're doing at work. And that creates its own problems because you're still working in cold conditions. So it's not necessarily a bad thing for employers to sort of stress test these things and find they don't work very well. The crucial thing is to learn the lessons in that and actually make the changes needed to ensure that there is clarity on what people are doing. A lot of this actually is around good communication. If people are clear beforehand on what to expect, it's rare, increasingly rare, that we get very bad weather with no warning. So employers should have an understanding a day, 2 days beforehand of the need to implement a specific policy or a specific approach. It's how effective they do that, I think.
That's a great point, Dan. And we'd say for all workplace policies that the key is good communication, isn't it? It's about consultation on it before it becomes the policy, negotiation, and making sure that colleagues, members know about the policy and that it's clear and accessible and that everyone knows what's what. Okay, I'm going to turn to some of the questions we've had posted during the webinar, all ones that we had sort of sent in advance. So one question we've had is is about, when some workplaces shut, but others don't. So someone's asked, what happens if children's schools are shut because of bad weather, which we, can happen quite often, not just for the safety of the children, but because maybe teachers can't get in and you can't have the kids at school without the staff there. So what happens in those situations?
I mean, generally speaking, it will be a contractual issue first and foremost. We have this quite a lot with members. So it would obviously be unacceptable to leave children under a certain age at home on their own. There will obviously be caring responsibilities there. Generally, we would expect the employer to be sympathetic under those circumstances, to understand the situation where people, again, can work from home, allow them to do so. If they're not able to work from home, it may be a case of substituting a day's leave, time off in lieu, potentially work a day not at work, not recorded for any disciplinary reasons. That's an absolutely critical point here. But it may be there's no entitlement to pay for that day. Again, that would depend on local circumstances, and if anybody's in that position, strongly recommend they speak to their union officer. There's a matter of urgency around that. But it would be unreasonable to discipline somebody for that to be the case, so long as sufficient notice was given. Obviously, if the school closes at 7 a.m. and the employee doesn't let their manager know until lunchtime, it maybe there are good reasons for that. Maybe you've got children to control, and that's problematic in itself. But again, if it's 5 hours into a shift and you haven't turned up, there are going to be obvious implications for that. But if people are able to give good notice, if it's clear what the circumstances are, if that can be substantiated, if, for instance, there's a local weather warning, amber weather warning, red weather warning of bad weather, snow in particular tends to be quite apparent. But obviously, the teachers may not live near to where the workplace is, but maybe the work's more clement in one area than the other. So providing supplementary evidence, I think, is very helpful. Again, people these days have got smartphones. Screenshot the BBC weather app, photo of that. It is snowing. If you're able to get a photo of what conditions are like outside, even better. That's all going to help to build the case. But it should ultimately be down to clear communication of what the circumstances are. Ideally, knowledge of what the employer's policy is around this, because again, there are times when schools close for other reasons in particular. Burst water pipes, lack of power. So again, that should be foreseeable. Some of these obviously are not really health and safety issues per se, but they're the kind of secondary issues that we do see quite a bit. But ultimately, clear communication, letting managers know as early as possible, having an understanding you may not get paid for that day, but there should be a degree of negotiation around that. And again, these are not the kind of things that tend to happen too often. The other side of that, of course, is if it is an ongoing situation, because there are times when we get very bad weather, particularly snow for several days, then that should be communicated very clearly as well. And again, the employer should have a policy there invoking that. So there really should be no surprises around this. If it is the case that the employer says, it is a loss of pay, there should be justification for that. It should be clear why that's the case, and that should be understood as well.
Absolutely. And is it worth also bearing in mind that you just said, we don't get a lot of very bad weather, but actually in some parts of the country, there's more than others.
Yeah.
And we've said you and I are both in the southeast where it is rarer, but I think in northern England and in Scotland, there's certainly more snow, and I think more flooding in many places. So geography is an issue here as well, isn't it? And people know their areas and should then foresee appropriately.
And again, another interesting point around this, and something that more employers, in my view, should be considering, is often there's a simple sort of central corporate policy that says this is what we do under these circumstances. But of course, you might have a national company that's got branches, has stores across the whole of the UK. You may well get very, very different weather conditions in one part of the country and another part. It doesn't necessarily mean you invoke the policy across the whole of the organisation, but there should be enough scope to apply it locally where needed. We have had circumstances where we've got an employer that's got a London head office, that because the weather's okay in London, we're not going to make extra payments, we're not going to put these provisions in place in the Scottish Highlands where the weather is much worse. That, again, doesn't happen very often, but there is sometimes this lack of understanding that the weather in London is not the weather for the whole of the UK. So there should also be a degree of local sympathy around this, a degree of local management around it. And where there isn't a central policy, where there isn't a clear policy, one certainly thing I'd recommend everybody does from today is go away and ask their employer about their policies around weather, whether they have one, and if not, they should be looking to negotiate one. What they mustn't do actually is just impose these things. You made a very important point earlier on around consultation and communication. It shouldn't be the case that someone either tries to download one off the internet and impose that, or says, well, yeah, we've sat down and scribbled this on the back of a piece of paper, here's only your policy. It genuinely needs to be consulted. As I'm sure was out in the chat, there is some very good guidance around there. TUC have done some excellent work. We've got our own guidance in GMB around this. So there are union sources that are available to look at these things.
Yeah, that's an excellent point. If the one takeaway, if you only take one thing, is check whether you've got a policy to cover bad weather. If you haven't, it's something that can be introduced and, like we said, proposed, consulted, negotiated, etc. If you've got one, always good to review. Check it covers the things that Dan's been mentioned. Compare it against some of the union examples we've got, and just to see if there are any things that you can make improvements on. Okay, Dan, can you tell me, please, what happens regarding pay if either a workplace is closed due to bad weather, or the workplace remains open, but that person can't get into work because of transport or blocked roads or whatever?
I mean, again, it will depend on the circumstances in terms of both what's happened and in terms of the contract of employment, as I understand it. And I must say, this is not an area of particular expertise of mine. But as a general rule of thumb, if it's the employer's decision to close a workplace, then effectively the sort of act detriment is not from the worker, it's from the employer themselves. So it'd be very difficult to argue there's a case for a loss of pay there because the employee has done nothing wrong. The worker has not forfeited their right to pay for that day, effectively. Again, it may be possible to work from home. There may be other things that someone can do. One thing that some employers are doing now is saying, right, you can't get into the office you're normally in because the roads are impassable, there's no trains running. Can you get to a different office in the same area? Are you able to go and work elsewhere? You know, for people that have laptops, for instance, we know of employers that are saying, okay, is it possible you can go and work in a temporary office? We'll hire a room in a hotel in some circumstances. Can you work in a cafe for a few hours? It depends again on the nature and the sort of sector, but some employers will increasingly look to do that because it gives some element of productivity and some flexibility. Where it is the case that people genuinely can't get into work, again, as long as they can show that they have made reasonable efforts to substantiate that, then I think it would be very harsh to withhold pay on that basis. It obviously depends on the nature of the work that's being done. It depends again on the contract of employment. Obviously, some people will have multiple jobs, may have different contracts, 0 hours, for instance. There it becomes more tricky. But ultimately, it shouldn't be the case that the employer is turning around and saying, right, we expect you to demonstrate to us that you got into your car or that you walked to your station and made every effort you could to get to work. Because we don't want circumstances where someone does get in their car, has an accident, and then potentially is very seriously hurt, maybe off work for months. That really doesn't help anybody. So as I said earlier, it should be sufficient to be able to say there's a weather alert in place. You know, I can evidence by photo if need be, these are the weather circumstances. But again, these all do ultimately boil down to what's in the contract. So it's really important if people are in this position that they do talk to union officials. Because it may be that things can be negotiated locally. It may be there are temporary measures in place. It may be if people are then looking to be disciplined for failure to turn up to work, there are mitigations, there is a defence there. But again, every case is unique, so I don't want to give general broad advice. If people aren't aware of what their contractual sort of stipulations and rights are, it's certainly a question to be asking where you've got HR or personnel departments, or indeed if you've got a copy of your contract of employment or letter of employment, it's worth looking at that as well to see if anything specifically in there.
Excellent advice, Dan. Before I go on to the next question, I just want to just bring everyone's attention to some really good points being raised in the chat, some great ideas being exchanged, and you know, tips both from reps and from my colleagues within the TUC. We've got one viewer who's got employees working in the Arctic and Antarctica, which fascinates me. I'd love to know what they're doing, but obviously, yeah, it's really cold there. And someone else has said, well, no, maybe the same person said they do have policies about working in very low temperatures, obviously extreme, the two poles, but it's maybe easier to get a cold weather policy there because it's so extreme than it might be in the UK. So yeah, that just fascinates me because it is so different, I guess. Right. Okay. We've had a question that asks, are there reasonable timeframes for an employer repairing ventilation or heating if it fails or if it's not working properly?
I mean, the law doesn't give absolute time frames on any of this stuff. It's very much around what's reasonably practicable under the circumstances. So what you'd expect really is two things. You'd expect clear information as to what has broken and what the implications of that breakdown are. Again, it may be from a ventilation point of view, that if you're in a situation like we're at the moment with high levels of flu, with COVID, a lot of respiratory viruses, you may need to open windows in the workplace. Because if the ventilation is air conditioning as well, and you're reliant on the air conditioner to take any particles away, then you'll have to try and get around that by opening windows up. That clearly will drop temperature. So it may be a case of saying, right, we are looking at a replacement unit or we're looking at replacement parts. That's tomorrow, it's 10 days away. It's rare. Some people on here will have in-house people that can do this work directly. You know, again, hospitals, schools to a degree. For many of us, it'll be a subcontractor that comes in, facilities management company possibly. But there should be an understanding and clarification around timescale. There's nothing hard and fast, but there should be provision made effectively to try and substitute where possible. So if it's a lack of temperature, then temporary heating systems in place, and those are not expensive these days. It's not particularly difficult to go and buy, you know, from Argos or Robert Dyer's a small heater where needed, or even bring in a larger temporary kind of cylinder heater. If it's a lack of ventilation, then it may be opening windows as well. But what's really important is there is an understanding of, you know, it's going to be this amount of time, and therefore, actually, we may need to redeploy people away from the affected area. We may need to ask people to work from home where they can do. It may be parts of the workplace may have to close as a result. You know, those temperatures, that 16, that 13 degrees, are pretty hard and fast. So if for any reason you can't maintain those, then there is a strong argument to say, right, and for that part of the workplace, that's effectively no-go zone until they can be raised back up. But there are lots of things employers can do. Again, it may be providing extra hot drinks, maybe providing extra thermal comfort, blankets, essentially. It shouldn't simply be the case of saying, right, you should be expected to sit here for the foreseeable future until we get this repaired or replaced. But there should be information given around what that timescale looks like. The law doesn't necessarily say you must do this within a certain time, but it does say you shall make sure that the temperature is reasonable. It doesn't define what that reasonable means per se, but it is 13, 16 degrees, in effect, from the guidance, the ACOP. But there's no sort of getting away from that. It's not qualified in terms of the temperature being reasonably practicable. The repair time might be reasonably practicable, but it should still be done. So it is very much give information on what the problem is, what the expected timescale will be, mitigate so far as is possible until that repair is made. Obviously, once the repair is made, check to ensure it's being done. The other thing I would expect is that all of this is done through consultation, that the safety committee should be aware of this. And of course, one of the key things around this, particularly for larger workplaces, is if a particular unit fails, if a particular system fails, there may be other parts of other buildings that have a similar problem. So it should trigger some action in terms of proactive inspection. Say, right, we've got a radiator that's failed here, or an air conditioning unit's failed. We need to go out and check and make sure other ones are working okay. Because the other thing we tend to find, particularly in larger sites where you've got a number of different working buildings, is the same things happening across a number of those buildings, but because people don't have a chance to talk to each other, you may have a safety committee meeting once a month or once every 3 months. You might be waiting 3.5 weeks to identify actually there's no heating in 3 of the 6 buildings. So doing that proactively, making sure those are in place, is really important. But yeah, information, consultation, and mitigation would be the 3 things there.
Thanks, Dan. Another viewer has asked, as there's no hard line within the law, as you said, around some of these things, it's reasonable and what's reasonably practicable. As there's no hard line within the law, it's the best way to confront an employer about cold temperatures is by having clear outlines in risk assessments and recording temperatures as evidence. Is that something we think safety reps should be on top of?
Yeah, absolutely. And there's a number of different ways to do that. The most straightforward is to get your own thermometer, ideally through your branch or through your union, and do your own recordings. And again, you want multiple recordings being taken in different buildings in different parts of the day. Another classic tactic is to keep the thermometer in the warmest part of the building, by the radiators, near the lovely bright sunshine window. So when the employer picks it up first thing in the morning, it's artificially high already before you start recording temperatures. So having the union's own independent method of measurement is really important. We can then look at those standards. The piece of guidance is L24, which is the approved code of practice for the workplace health and safety and welfare regulations, the 1992 ones. You can download that off the HSE website for free. That's very clearly in there. I think it's Regulation 7 that's got the detail. But that effectively says to the employer very clearly it's 16 degrees or 13 degrees indoors. Then a question, I think, of doing two things. One is to make sure you've got measurements, and it may be that as part of the inspection regime, you check those temperatures, you check those measurements. The other thing, and possibly the more important thing actually, is talking to the workforce. Because again, if people are obviously shivering, if they're wearing coats, scarves, hats, on a day when it doesn't feel that cold, there's plenty an issue there. Having an individual safety rep or a safety committee raise this is powerful. Being able to say, actually, we've got 50 people that have all filled out a quick survey that said they all feel cold, and it's this particular area during these times of the day, is much harder evidence in terms of there being a very concrete, specific problem. One of the biggest issues we have with cold weather, one of the reasons we're in the webinar, is that people see this as a very short duration, one-off, discrete event. We get a couple of days of snow, bad weather, it's cold, it goes away, people forget about it. But actually, when you tend to look at these things, they happen quite frequently. They might happen 3 or 4 times during a 3-month period. It's just that no one ever thinks there's a ongoing problem here, because the weather is, as you said, seasonal, cyclical. But actually, once you can evidence this, once you say, yeah, we do it every time the temperature drops below a certain point, people are sitting here freezing, you can start putting measures into place. But having that challenge with the evidence behind it is really important. And again, one of the most powerful things to do is to ask employers, if they refuse to do something, put it in writing and keep that so you've got evidence. We've raised this previously. You haven't acted upon it. Here's what you said last time. This is still a problem. Go away and fix it.
Yeah, excellent advice, Dan. And we think that's, let's face it, it's what reps and safety reps do as part of their everyday. They talk to their colleagues, talk to members, observe in the workplace, and that would be taking temperatures, and then speak to the employer about it. If you make it part of that regular rep activity, it's perhaps not too onerous. It's not another thing to do, because we all know that reps are time poor, and there's a lot of stuff comes your way. And we're not saying this is something new. It can just become part of the regular mapping the workplace, inspecting, etc. So hopefully it becomes incorporated so that it doesn't become, a shock. It's snowing, etc. Okay, is there something, a particular risk assessment around bad weather that an employer might need to do if there are disabled workers amongst their employees? Is there any special considerations there?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. There are, again, a number of different things to look at. There's no sort of hard and fast template off this. There's no one-size-fits-all solution in terms of risk assessment. It will depend on the individual worker, their particular condition or disability, what that may mean in practice in terms of what the hazards may be that are more specific to them. But in just very simple terms, for someone that might have a visual impairment, there obviously may be issues in terms of getting into work safely during fog or mist conditions. So it shouldn't be assumed that people can safely get to work. People that have got issues in terms of mobility, if you're a wheelchair user, for instance, ice and snow will be particularly problematic. There's nothing remarkable about that. There may be a need to put particular measures in place. It may be simple as gritting. It may be a case of making sure when people come into the workplace, if they've got temporary matting down, that matting isn't saturated. That's going to cause a slip or a trip hazard that's more pronounced for someone that has a need for support. Again, the same will be true of people that need to use potentially a walking stick or potentially a frame to help with their mobility. More generally, if you've got bad weather conditions and you're in an office that's got very good temperature control, but there's a fire alarm, for instance, how will that impact on people getting out of the building safely? What will happen to them when they're outside of the building? So there are a number of things that are quite individualised that will need to be looked at. It may be that a reasonable adjustment under a different piece of legislation, the Equality Act 2010, will be under certain conditions. It's safer for those employees to work from home or stay at home, depending on circumstances. Again, the problem is that these things will be quite individualistic. So it depends on the individual, depends on the weather circumstance, depends on what's happening. So there, what you would want, I think, is a policy position that says, under these circumstances, when we know there's bad weather coming in, particularly for snow and ice, but generally when this weather is deteriorating, we will have a discussion before that happens, talk about what the potential hazards will be, because again, the worker will know very well what their own capabilities are, what the issues are for them. There'll be an agreed plan of action, there'll be an agreed risk assessment. It doesn't need to be a hugely detailed piece of work, but it needs to understand what the key risks are and how they can be mitigated. And if they can't be mitigated, then the adjustment may be the individual stays at home for that day. It may be the worker does something else that day. It may be they have to do a different work activity that day. What you shouldn't have are really hard and fast prescriptive rules that have a particular conception of what the individual can or can't do that's determined by managers or HR, not by the individual worker themselves. So it's not a particularly easy thing to do, but a lot of that is actually around practical thinking rather than trying to do something sort of off plan that really doesn't make any sense. And the worker absolutely must be centered at that. It has to work around what they are comfortable with, what they're able to do, and what's safe for them to do ultimately.
Absolutely. And I think, you mentioned that let's maybe not do this when it starts snowing. These things can be addressed outside of a bad weather period. And remember also, when it comes to adjustments for a member or colleague who may have a disability, we do have some resources on reasonable adjustment passports that we can also post a link to, because there's some key things there that apply all year round, no matter what the weather. We've had a bit of discussion in the chat, and we've had a question about types of thermometers. You've mentioned that a portable one is obviously really helpful because you can move it around, take it to different parts of the workplace. But should people be looking at a digital, a mercury one? I mean, this really isn't something I know a lot about. So does it matter?
I mean, essentially not really. There is some merit actually in having a classic mercury thermometer because it's very difficult to misinterpret it. It's very clear cut what the reading is. It really will depend on what can be funded either by the branch or by the union, what the availability is. The two really important things are that these things are accessible. They're not locked away. They're not bought and then gathering dust, and also that people know where to place them. There can be issues with digital ones. I think someone mentioned calibration. It tends to be less that than battery deterioration. Effectively, if you've got a good thermometer with old batteries in it, it may not be quite as effective and as efficient as when it was brand new. But then keeping batteries up to date is quite important. A good bit of discipline is when people are doing inspections, be taking temperature checks generally, see how things are working. There's no problem, in my view, with having a thermometer next to some kind of work measure, work monitor, work thermometer. So if the employer's put something in there that says it's 24 degrees today, having something that verifies that and checks it, I don't think is a bad thing. Because if there are discrepancies, it may identify actually the work system. The employer's own system is at fault. It needs servicing, calibration. So that shouldn't necessarily be a problem. But again, it's much easier to do that if you've got something that doesn't require fresh batteries. So yeah, it's probably slightly old-fashioned, but there is some merit in having the more classic style. The most important thing is you have confidence in the readings. We have seen circumstances in the past, particularly during COVID, where both employers and latterly some members, some branches, were giving people individual head-type digital thermometers. Wouldn't necessarily recommend doing that. If someone feels like they have a fever, it's generally be a good idea to send them to get treatment rather than having that kind of in-house kind of thing. Different if the company's got a doctor or a nurse, but just a general rule of thumb, you want a thermometer that's measuring the ambient temperature, not something that's specific to individual temperatures, just for clarity more than anything. But yeah, the most important thing really is keeping those readings to hand.
Yeah, they can be quite different, the ambient temperature to someone's individual temperature, for sure. We've had a question as well about people who are going through the menopause and the temperatures in workplaces there, especially in workplaces like hospitals or, where it's, it can be maybe hot.
Yep. So again, there will be issues around members that do have menopause. You would like to think at this time that most employers will have some sympathy to that and also have a policy around that. GMB has its own menopause guidance, and the TUC's got very good menopause guidance. So that shouldn't be contentious. Obviously, the issue there tends to be the drops in temperature. So care homes, hospitals in particular, will tend to have very high ambient temperatures generally for health reasons. That generally will be something that workers will kind of adapt to over the course of the day. But obviously, A, if it's extremely cold outside, and then B, you are going through the menopause, that temperature fluctuation can have real issues. So again, it's difficult to be prescriptive under health and safety law. The menopause isn't something that's kind of directly covered, but that reasonable requirement for temperature should be reasonable for that individual. And it may be a case that there is a need there for some sort of provision of extra breaks, provision of a fan possibly, work in a warmer area if it's the coldness that's the issue. And that may only be a temporary thing. It may be a small space to warm up in. That would not, in my view, be unreasonable. This is more of an art than a science to a degree. There isn't going to be a huge amount of guidance and regulation there that says, in this circumstance, do this. It's about looking at what's reasonable under the circumstances. But it may well be if there's a well thought through, sort of, again, jointly agreed menopause policy in place, that provision can be there. Obviously, what we're not looking for is people that are going through the menopause being expected to stay in the workplace, particularly if they're suffering. If the temperature brings on kind of a very physical reaction, then we don't want people sitting at desks or trying to do a job of work when they're obviously in pain and unwell. So it is about what's reasonable. But again, in both circumstances, the menopause is not a new phenomenon. Even if the policy approach is quite a new thing, temperature is not a new issue. So within that menopause policy, there should be some provision there around changing temperature and temperature at work. If they're not in there, it's, again, definitely something to be raising and for the safety committee to be looking at, in my view.
Yeah, that's really helpful, Dan. And you mentioned there we have guidance on the menopause for workplace reps. We can certainly direct the audience to that because it's not. Yeah, of course, the temperature is an important thing, but there's lots of other factors at play regarding colleagues who may be going through the menopause to consider. So, part of a broader discussion, really. I think we've got time for one more question. Which is about lots of workplaces aren't just, they're open to the public. They deal with third parties and things. Yes. So sometimes, customers, clients, patients, etc., their expectations of the service they're going to receive might be different from what can actually be given when the weather's bad. So what should happen there? Is it the employer's responsibility? Should people, do you think, customers should just use their common sense and think, I'm not going to get the same service I might if the weather was better? Because obviously, for all the reasons you've outlined, things are different when the weather's bad.
Yeah, I mean, again, you would expect it to be good communication in the first instance. Most large companies these days, most large employers, be they local authorities, be they hospital trusts, will have a social media presence. If bad weather is expected, you would expect them to be putting proactive communication up beforehand. Say, over the next day or two, you may experience some issues in terms of our services because of disruption due to weather. Certainly on the train services that I use, the minute there's an amber weather warning, you immediately get something to ping up on Twitter. I get an email saying, services may be cancelled at short notice, which is not ideal, but it does help manage expectation. We do know, again, through bitter experience, that people, particularly at hospitals and schools, can become very aggressive if they find out that their appointment's been cancelled or there's a delay in getting their child to school from school. So the more people can have information beforehand, the better. It should also be understood by the employer, though, that there can be a flashpoint there in terms of violence and aggression. That is a foreseeable risk that needs to be managed. Now, part of that management may be ensuring there are extra staff present. So if the school is being closed, say if there's an inability to get the school open in the morning, it may be that you do need to have people outside the school to explain that. Having a single member of staff who's a teaching assistant or a secretary is not really acceptable. It will need a number of people to be there to help A, deal with potentially a number of queries, but B, to ensure that there is someone there to support if there's an issue and to witness. So it really depends on the circumstances, it depends on the nature of the work that's being done, but anything that's customer facing, good clear communication as early as possible, an understanding of what the implications may be of that. People will expect to a degree that buses and trains may not run. If they get into a supermarket and find there's only one checkout open because there's only 4 staff in the shop, then again, it needs to be understood. And again, tannoy announcements might be the answer here. I'm very sorry, we only have one. You'll experience longer queues than normal. We won't be able to provide you with customer service. But a lot of these things are explaining to people, this is what's happening, this is why it's happening, and this is what the impact will be. The other side of it, of course, is there may be safety issues for the public themselves. And if that is the case, if things can't be open because there's a safety concern or a health and safety concern, if there's a particular health issue, then that needs to be explained very clearly as well. Because what you don't want is people trying to come into a workplace that may be partially or fully closed because you've got flooding. So that information is very important. Getting it out there is very important, and doing it as many ways as possible actually is critical within that.
Thanks, Dan. And perhaps that point about communication to third parties, clients, customers, patients, etc., can be included in the bad weather policy so that it's clear. You know, everyone knows what's expected of them, and have it clearly written down.
Yeah.
Okay, I think this has been a fantastic webinar. I've learned absolutely loads, and I hope our audience have as well. Dan, you've been really insightful, incredibly detailed answers. Thank you so much. And I think just to reiterate again, the main takeaways for our audience: talk to your members, see if you've got a bad weather policy. Don't wait until bad weather for getting one implemented. It can be done at any time of the year. If you've got one, review it. And get hold of a thermometer that you can walk around the workplace with and take readings. I suspect it's quite interesting anyway, even when the weather's not bad, just to do that sometimes. So maybe that's just me. So thank you everyone for joining us today. We'll see you very soon for another webinar. I think the next one is in Heart Unions Week, which is in a couple of weeks' time, and it's about pay bargaining. So I look forward to seeing you all then. Bye-bye for now.